It's this thing. It's this entity. It's there. But the moment you try to define it, you do it a disservice. What is the Russian soul? I think it's ever changing, ever evolving. It's part of Russia, but it unites all Russians. It's real. And anybody who thinks that we can break Russia through sanctions, through whatever we do, let me say you this. The supporters of Navalny don't have a Russian soul. They're soulless people because they have forgotten what it means to be Russian. That doesn't mean that you have to support Vladimir Putin to be Russian. You don't. There is a lot of opposition to Vladimir Putin in Russia. I'll tell you that right now. Not because they hate Putin or hate Russia. They just aren't happy. The one thing I heard over and over again is, I have questions. I have a lot of questions for Vladimir Putin. I have questions about this. I have questions about that. That's a sign of a healthy society. This isn't lockstep, we're doing whatever Putin wants, but they're Russian. And Putin is the Russian leader right now. And if what we don't understand is, if we think that, if we overheard somebody ask questions, we go, Putin's weak. We can exploit that, bring him down. Wrong answer. Because the Russian people are rallying around the Russian government in a existential conflict against the collective West. And coming to grips with that, what seems to be two contradictory things, potential dissatisfaction with the leadership and yet the highest level of support, that the leadership has had. How do you bring those two things together? The Russian soul. The Russian soul brings it together, the essence of Russia. And we need to understand that, Americans, we're a soulless people. I don't mean that as an insult. What I mean is, who are Americans? I mean, the only true Americans are the American Indians, and we've spent decades, centuries slaughtering them and oppressing them. We put them on reservations, and we still treat them like absolute crap. They're the only ones who can say we have an American soul, because they're the only ones who have a distinct link to the essence of what America is. Everybody else is an immigrant. All right. And that's not bad. That means that when your parents arrive, you have a French soul, a German soul, an African soul, a Mexican soul, a Spanish soul. You're bringing in these experiences that when they come together, they don't come together to create a soul, because a soul is unifying. America has an ideal. America has a vision of freedom. I think freedom is a unifying factor, but it's imperfectly pursued. But that's why there's a difference between America and Russia. I'm not saying that one's better than the other. I like the concept of freedom. I like what America stands for. I don't like how we're doing it, but I like what we stand for. But I respect the Russian soul because I recognize that it exists. There's a lot of people who write about Russia who don't talk about this, who avoid it. The Michael McFalls, the Fiona Hills, the Angela Stents, people of this nature. They write about Russia, and they try to talk about Russia as Putin, as an autocracy, as a soulless people who have married themselves. And you get it all wrong. Russia is Russia. Russia goes down from these people. It started from the very beginning when Kievan Rus was born, and they've gone through the transitions, through the Golden Horde. They've gone through the Tsarist period, the communist period, the post-communist period. All of this combines this history, this experience, this culture, this culture makes the Russian soul. And if you don't understand it, you'll never understand Russia. And that's my big takeaway, is the American people haven't a clue what they're talking about with Russia, because we try to examine Russia through an American prism, a prism of our own experience. But our experience is a soulless experience. Our experience is defined by an idea, by an ideal of freedom. And then we get frustrated when we look at Russia and we say, well, they don't share our values. Well, their values are defined differently. Their values are defined by what we call the Russian soul. Our values are defined by an ideal of freedom. It doesn't mean that they're incompatible, but it does mean that they're not one and the same. And if you're trying to evaluate one in a vacuum and just say, well, this is the American way of looking at it, now we examine Russia and we find Russia to be inadequate. That's just like a Russian looking and saying, this is the Russian way. And I found this a lot. This is the Russian way. And we look at America and we see that America is inadequate. Well, America may be inadequate from a Russian perspective, but it's pretty adequate from an American perspective, especially in what we claim to believe in: freedom, liberty, justice for all. These are concepts that are enshrined in the Constitution. But as Americans, well, I think the other thing I would ask Americans to do is please start falling in love with America as much as the Russians have fallen in love with Russia. The people I saw were patriotic. The people I saw believed in their country. The people I saw understood their country. They are enmeshed in the history and the culture of Russia. Even the average person on the street, if I pulled them aside and I said, let's talk about Dostoevsky, they will know who Dostoevsky is. They'll talk about Tolstoy. They'll talk about the poets, Pushkin, Lermontov. They'll talk about all of this. They'll be able to talk about the history. They have a grasp. They don't have PhDs, but I could go pull a combiner off of the mower that's taking down the grain in the Volgograd region and sit down and bring up Tolstoy. He'll know who Tolstoy is. I can go right now and grab an average American off the street and say, who is Emerson? Huh? Walt Whitman? Who? What about the great American poet Frost? Huh? Nothing there. Then we talk about the history. They don't know our history. So what we have is a nation of people who claim to embrace an ideal, an idea, but we don't know how we got there. We don't know why it's not working, because it's not working, guys. It's not working. And to understand why it's not working, we have to understand who we are and what we are. And I would just ask, the lesson that I learned is that we need to start loving our country as much as the Russians love their country. And if we did that, if we embraced who we are, faults and all, we'd be better positioned to fix it. And why do I believe Russia is going to come out of this okay? Because this isn't about Putin. Putin is the leader today. He's 70 years old. Putin's going to be gone. Russia is forever. Russia doesn't end. Russia exists. And it's going to exist after Putin. And what's going to define the Russian existence post-Putin is the Russian soul. And we need to come to grips with that, because 10 years from now, Putin will probably not be in power. 80-year-old men shouldn't be leading nations. Hint, hint, America. But Russia will still exist. 10 years from now, Biden's not going to be there, but America's going to still exist. We have to stop looking at great nations like the United States and Russia in terms of individuals who are there through an accident of history. We have to look at this in a broader way. And if we do that, we'll find there's actually a lot more in common than we think. And that this drift towards conflict is not only unnecessary, but tragic. We shouldn't be in conflict with Russia. There's no reason to be in conflict with Russia.
One other question that I'm curious about. Did you get any discussion or any information on, and this is something Americans don't even know. I have, Russian friends, lots of Russian friends who it's like their mother-in-law is their wife's half Ukrainian, their mother-in-law's in the Ukraine. Did you get any discussion about the ties between Russia and Ukraine, how the Russians see the Ukrainians as friends, as family members, blah, 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 and that dynamic?
100%. I mean, the bottom line is that the takeaway is if you rub a Russian, you get a Ukrainian. And if you rub a Ukrainian, you get a Russian. The two are the same. Every city I went, there's a huge Ukrainian population. Half the people I met said I was born in Ukraine, or my mother was born in Ukraine. The other half said, I have an uncle in Ukraine, I have a brother in Ukraine, I have a sister in Ukraine. You can't separate the two. Now, the more complicated discussion is the historical foundation of the Ukrainian state. What is Ukraine? What defines Ukraine? And here we get into a lot of nationalism and such. The Russians are quick to say and to point out that, for instance, I've had this discussion with Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador. He speaks about, the Metropolitan Museum of Art reclassifying what have long been considered Russian masterpieces, Russian artists, as now Ukrainian artists, because in 1848, when the artist was born. He was born in, Mariupol. And of course, the Ukrainians said, well, that's a Ukrainian city. But when he was born, it wasn't a Ukrainian city because Ukraine didn't exist. The notion of Ukraine didn't exist. The notion of a Ukrainian nation didn't exist. Um, but you say that, but then you understand that today, the Ukrainians who are fighting right now, they're fighting for Ukraine. So in their minds, Ukraine is a reality. And it's not just the Western Ukrainians that are fighting. There's people in Kiev who believe in the concept of a Ukrainian state. And so there's a fight for the history of Ukraine taking place right now in Russia. And it's a fight that I wish was being done with more historic accuracy and less national prejudice. There's a huge prejudice right now on both sides. You have the Ukrainians right now just trying to pretend Russia doesn't exist. Russia never existed. And they're wrong. But you have some Russians that are doing the same thing to Ukraine, and therefore they're not respecting the fact that there are people in Ukraine who believe in this concept of a Ukrainian nation. But so, you have to push that aside. When you push that aside and get out of the politics of what the historical definition of Ukraine is, you get to the fact that Ukraine and Russia are the same damn thing, the same thing. I tell this story all the time. It's one that just breaks my heart. But Wagner surrounded a group of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, and they shouted in, "Surrender, brothers. We'll lay down your arms. We'll treat you okay. You'll live." And the Ukrainian soldiers shouted back, "Russians don't surrender." Now, that's a battle cry from World War II that was made famous by a Russian guy who ended up winning the hero of the Soviet Union. But the Germans said, "Surrender." He said, "Russians don't surrender." And they killed him. And, of course, Wagner killed these guys. But the point being made is Russians are fighting Russians. That's the reality. Russians are fighting Russians. It's the same people. There might be politics aside. So this group of Russians call themselves Ukrainians, and this group of Russians call themselves Russians. But they're the same people. Again, we come back to what I said. You rub this person, this Russian, they become a Ukrainian. You rub this Ukrainian, they become a Russian. It's the same blood, the same people. And 30 years ago, they were marrying each other, living with each other in peace, working everywhere they wanted. The military, there's military officers today, colonels, who in the Russian army who served with colonels in the Ukrainian army as they entered together as captains, as majors. They fought together. They went to the same academies. But then in 1992, boom, it went away. You now have Ukraine and you now have Russia, and now they're at war. But understand, when they started their lives, they were the same people. They went to the same academy. They were fighting on the same side. They're best friends. And I have to tell you, military officers who go through the junior officer experience together, where everybody's, picking on you and sort of survival, you build this little mafia of lieutenants to survive. That's a bond that can never be broken. And so when we talk about a civil war right now, it is a real civil war. This is a civil war between Russians that's been promoted by the West. We've exploited some political differences to allow brother to fight brother, cousin to fight cousin, and it is one of the greatest tragedies of modern history.